Hi, 20s. Welcome to the video on evidences of evolution. Today, your goal or your learning intention is learning about the different mechanisms that have influenced the change of populations over time, reviewing evidence to support evolution of modern species from ancestral forms. How do I know that you've touched on this learning intention? Is first, you can explain what a fossil is and link it to comparative anatomy. Comparative anatomy, you may remember that term from yesterday, talking about Buffon and Cuvier, defining within comparative anatomy homologous and analogous structures. I want you to be able to tell me what an embryo is and see how it creates connections between species, define DNA, and explain the role of DNA in making connections, again, between different species. We're going to start off in fossils, transitional fossils, anatomy, and distribution. Now, although they all have separate titles, we're going to call this number one because they're all very much linked. We're going to start with what is a fossil. So we know that Lyell's geology started to look at the different layers of Earth. So he looked at what we would call strata. That was his contribution. Cuvier and Buffon before him really looked at the fossils. Even Lamarck looked at fossils, and we're looking at how fossils made connections between species. So the younger layers of Earth, so the ones closest to the surface we are currently on, are going to be the much younger species, and most of them are probably going to be alive today. If we follow in chronological order as best we can, because there's not always going to be fossils in every layer, we can work our way backwards, down deep, working our way through the rocks, digging deeper, okay? And we can actually find common ancestors between species that are modern species and ancient species. So that's how fossils create a connection and help us see the world of evolution. Now, fossils is the big idea. Within this big idea, we're really looking at transitional fossils. I'm going to go back to the picture before this just to show you kind of how I'm going to work this together. So the picture before this in the corner here just shows a geological time scale. And if you notice right here at the top, it says it's hard to see, Cenozoic, and it says tertiary and quaternary. Tertiary was where Lyell worked. He was like, hey, I can find all these phylum and different things in the tertiary period. What we now know is we can work our way all the way back to Precambrian times, which is times before we even had anything walking on Earth. So this is showing the strata that we would find fossils. Now the strata hold what we would now call transitional fossils. So fossils are the big idea, but transitional fossils is really what helps us fill in the gap. So here's a picture of a four-legged species that walked on Earth. We know most modern day whales of some sort actually at one point walked on Earth and then actually went back into the water. So they were water, earth, water for some of them. So what we're looking at here is a transition between the guy that is walking on four legs to the modern toothed whale or something like an orca, for an example. Scientists were able to look at the bone structure or the fossils of the ancient species and recognize that they looked very, very, very similar and had a lot of similarities to the modern toothed whale. This is using comparative anatomy. Well, what they didn't know was how closely related they are. So what ended up happening is you have to use what's called transitional fossils. It's where we take the fossil record and we work backwards in time and we unearth what we call these transitions. These fossils fill in the gaps in the records we have. So Cuvier would have used this, Buffon was onto the idea of this, okay? It allows us to see the connection between the ancient species and the modern day species. So what you're seeing is we have an animal that was walking on land, and its skull has already evolved to be very similar to the characteristics of the whale. But what it doesn't have is the body of the whale. So probably what happened was an environmental pressure occurred where it could no longer just hunt for food on land. It started to wade into shallow water. As it moved into shallow water, it realized it was easier to swim when it was paddling its feet. So over long periods of time, okay, the spine elongated, the legs shortened to get better paddling abilities, and the hand structure probably became broader for better paddling. So if you go from the top structure to the one just below it, that would be a transition, showing how it's moving from walking on land to swimming in water. Now again, this flexible backbone allows for paddling, and over time it may paddle further and further out into water. Now it's recognizing I need to be able to breathe underwater. So it's going to start to develop and lose things, develop things that help it in its environment and lose things, okay, that are not needed anymore, such as hind legs. Most common toothed whales actually have a bone where their hind legs once were. So this leads us to this idea of patterns of distribution. We can now look across the earth to figure out how animals were closely related. You may have heard the word Pangea before, or the supercontinent, in which all of the continents at one point in time touched. We know this because we can look at transitional fossils, and we can see that there are fossils that just are distributed across all the continents of animals that are similar. So fossils have allowed us to understand how geographically close environments were and how likely it is to be populated by related species. All right. So we can go back and we can start looking for connections. Animals that are on islands, such as, for example, Australia. Australia has animals that are actually closely related to those found in mainland China, okay, and in Japan. And that's because at one point in time they would have been touching. So we can actually look at animals on islands and see how they closely resemble those of the closest continent. If you have a coastline or neighboring a continent, you're probably going to have similar fossils because, again, at one point, this is the idea of continental drift. At one point, they were all touching, and as they drifted, animals got marooned or left in one area and could no longer move back and forth between areas. This is going to lead us into our very last idea of fossils to the world of anatomy. Now, we've talked about what are fossils, how transitional fossils allow us to see connections, but I haven't explained what they're looking for, and that's where this comes into play is anatomy. The anatomy of animals, we have two types. We have homologous structures and analogous structures. Homologous is the ones that scientists use to actually create connections between species. Homologous structures are similar structural elements and origin, but have different functions. So they may not look the same and they may function different, but if you look at their actual structural element, the bone structure, it's very similar. This is showing a common ancestor. And a difference in their anatomy is based on, again, evolution and the movement towards an organism's different lifestyle and environment they live in that's put pressures upon them to actually fit that environment. So an example of this is humans, frogs, bats, porpoises, and horses. If you actually look at the bone structure of all of their hands, okay, they actually have pretty much the same structures of bones. We all have the same types of phalanges, our metacarpals, and all those kinds of things. So it's actually very interesting. Although the shape and structure look very, very different, the function comes from the structure comes from a similar place. So this can show that there is somewhere way back in a very long time ago, possibly a common ancestor that gave rise. And as we evolved to fit our different environments, the function of the hand became different. So this is what scientists are using to help understand the relationship between an ancestor, an ancient ancestor, and a modern day species. The other side to the anatomy part is an analogous structure. Now, prior to understanding anatomy, before Buffon started really thinking about it, before Cuvier really solidified it, people used analogous structures to make assumptions. Analogous structures are body parts that serve the same function, but are actually very different structurally. If we look at their embryonic structure or their structure bone-wise, there is no similarities. So there's really no common evolutionary origin. So think of a shark, a penguin, and a dolphin. All of them have fins of some shape and form. A shark is a fish, a penguin is a bird, a dolphin is a mammal. What they want to say is, do they have a common ancestor? They all have fins of some shape or form. Do they have a common ancestor? When we look at the bones of a shark, a penguin, and a dolphin, we can see that their fin bones are actually vastly different, and there is no relationship there. They do not have similar structures whatsoever. We can see that a mammal may have similar structures to other mammals or in reptiles, perhaps, okay? But you have to look for the same bone structure. So that's the difference between a homologous and an analogous structure. So people say, for example, dinosaurs looked like this. We have their bones, and then people have put over what they think dinosaurs will look like, scaly, eyes on the sides of their head. So people right away, oh, they must be related to reptiles. But the truth is if you look at the DNA and the bone structure of dinosaurs, they're more related towards the common day bird than they are any reptile. That's going to lead us into embryology, part 2 of this. Embryology is looking at the embryo. So the embryo develops shortly after fertilization. It's a concept we talk about in Science 9. It's a concept we refer to back to in Bio 30. Embryos happen when an egg and a sperm, fuse together. It goes through a couple different transitions, and then you have an embryo implanted into the uterine wall. If we look at the structure of the embryo and as it develops, because embryology will be within the first 8 weeks of conception, because after that, you're into a completely different type of fetal development. So we need to look at the first 8 weeks of development. Embryology, looks at the different organisms and how they exhibit similar stages of embryonic development. We can then say related species could share similar adult appearances, but for sure share similar embryonic features. If you look at the picture I've given, a fish, a chicken, a pig, and a human, what you may recognize and may not recognize, simply because I know what I'm looking at, but is a chicken, this is the yolk sac. So this is a yolk, right? You can see one fish has it kind of here. You can't really see it on the pig. It's there though, and a human also has one. A yolk sac for most animals is nutrition. It helps as the fetal development occurs or as embryonic development occurs. The yolk sac gives nutrition. Humans don't use it for that at all. We've evolved out of using our yolk sac for that. But the point is that because all of them have yolk sacs, at some point in time, we can say that is a stage of embryonic development that is related. There may have been a common ancestor in the past. So then they look for other commonalities and look for other ways that they're developing. The way the eye structure happens, the way that certain developmental points happen, will all give them evidence towards a possible common ancestor. So embryology is used. Now, in conjunction with embryology, this is one idea. The next one is molecular biology, and I gave it its own part because embryology looks at a already combined male and female egg and sperm. Molecular biology looks even more, it looks deeper. It goes past just looking at the embryo and instead looks at our DNA. So molecular biology is looking at DNA, and DNA is passed from parents to offspring, deoxyribonucleic acid. It's what makes you, you. Everything on there codes for proteins that makes you. Hair color, eye color, height, weight, freckles, no freckles, left-handed, right-handed. It's all there in genes. So what happens is the evolutionary relationships are reflected in DNA and their proteins. We can map DNA. We know they're made out of nitrogenous bases called A, Cs, Ts, and Gs. Again, Bio 30 concept. You will learn this. What happens is those A, Cs, Ts, and Gs are like a storybook. It tells the story of you, and they're in a specific order so that you, when you are created, have all the features you have. Your story will then be passed on to your children, and your children will get half of the DNA you have. And it combines with the person that you have a child with, and then they have a whole new set of stories. It's very, very cool. But the thing is we can take DNA and we can trace it back. We can look at DNA and we can look at all the bases and where they are on certain chromosomes, and we can actually look to see, is there relationships between the DNA we have and relationships between the DNA that came before us in, for example, chimpanzees. So we can compare DNA. A process that compares DNA, for example, is electrophoresis. It cuts DNA and looks at how big of chunks are there, and they can match it, But other ways they look at it is just simply mapping it. And they look for simple patterns that link to possible recent common ancestors. Now, DNA is found in the form of a chromosome. So chromosomes are now, we know, the carriers of genes and how genetic information is passed on. Lamarck, Darwin, Cuvier, Buffon, Lyell, all of those, that nobody knew what a chromosome was. Nobody knew what DNA was. DNA wasn't discovered until about 1953, Watson and Crick. So if you think about when those guys existed in 1792 and 1886 or whatever their years are, they had no idea what this is, but they were able to see how things are passed on. Now, with our understanding of DNA and genes and chromosomes, we can see a larger, broader picture of how evolution actually occurs. Genetic evidence and the understanding of heredity and how mutations lead to different things supports the theories of evidences and evolution. Darwin said that there is adaptations that are better for an environment, and then those animals survive. We called it selective advantage. We said they'll have a mutation that allows for them to be a better fit for their environment. Where does this mutation arise from? It arises in your chromosome and your DNA. Something small that gets changed that allows for you or your future generations to have an advantage over the people around you. So, ladies and gentlemen, these are the evidences that are backing up the theory of evolution. Please make sure you have it in your notes. You're going to take today and yesterday's combined understanding, and you're going to do something called a NOVA lab, which allows you to see how the evidences of evolution get played out in a fun little activity and game. I hope you have a great day.